When we think about what is driving climate change, the images that probably come to mind first are the power plants that burn fossil fuels, or the exhaust coming out of the planet's nearly 1.4 billion cars on the road. But across the world and in the United States, more than 10% of global warming emissions come from producing food. A big part of those emissions come from soil management, such as tilling or the application of fertilizers, which in the United States produce the greenhouse warming equivalent of releasing nearly 300 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. That's over half the greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. Now, the good news is that we already know several farming approaches that work to draw CO2 from the atmosphere into soils without sacrificing the production capacity of farmland, meaning soil management doesn't have to be part of the climate change problem. It can be part of the solution. In the Roads to Removal report, researchers examined 3 soil management techniques, looking at how much CO2 they could potentially remove from the atmosphere on an annual basis, and where such approaches could be implemented in ways that maintain or improve crop production, rather than compete with it. Lead author of the Soils team, Dr. Allegra Mayer of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, explains.
There are many ways to increase soil carbon, but in our chapter, we identified 3 main practices that take carbon out of the atmosphere using photosynthesis and store it in soil. All 3 of these practices specifically increase the time over the year where plants are growing and photosynthesizing. The first practice we looked at is called perennial field borders. In this practice, you grow native grasses or native trees around the edges of fields where they're growing constantly and bringing down carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil. The second practice we looked at is called carbon cropping. In this practice, we expect there's going to be a reduced demand for corn ethanol due to changing energy demands in the market. Instead of planting corn, we can plant a perennial native grass called switchgrass. Switchgrass can then be harvested for biomass, where it can be combusted and stored down in deep storage and also used for carbon-negative bioenergy. At the same time, switchgrass roots are both denser and deeper than corn roots, and they grow year-round. The amount of carbon that we can store just by planting switchgrass instead of by corn is quite a lot in these areas, and we're not interfering with food production in this case. The final lever that we looked at is called cover cropping. Cover cropping is an opportunity for farmers to get paid through an additional revenue stream, and essentially, while they're rotating through their cash crops, whether it's corn and soy, there's often a period of bare soil. If they plant vegetation during that period, even if they're not harvesting it, they can get paid for the carbon sequestered during that period. We found that cover cropping has by far the biggest potential in the United States to remove carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in soil. And that's because it doesn't interfere with cash crop income for the farmers. So they're going to choose it because it's an additional revenue stream to make some money.
Collectively, the techniques examined here could remove hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 annually if farmers were offered moderate prices to change their farming practices. The report examined the carbon removal capacity of these methods at 2 price points and found that for a financial incentive of $40 per metric ton of CO2, nearly 200 million tons of CO2 could be removed by soil management. At $100 per ton, that value increases 5-fold. The potential is significant, but these practices have so many other benefits for farmers and for the environment that their value goes beyond the goal of removing CO2. Here's Dr. Corin Scown, a Roads to Removal collaborator from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, who is examining how different CO2 removal strategies relate to one another and can provide co-benefits.
Some of these strategies have incredible co-benefits, and it's part of why I think that agricultural soil management and forest management are 2 of the big kind of low-hanging fruits that we should go after in the near term. On the agricultural soil management side, if you can restore the carbon content of our soils and improve the soil texture, you have all kinds of interesting benefits around the water holding capacity of the soils, around the long-term crop yields on those soils.
Cover crops in particular help enrich and strengthen soils, reducing soil erosion, reducing the need for fertilizer application, reducing nitrous oxide emissions, and improving water retention. In addition, all of these techniques, cover cropping, creating perennial field borders with trees and native grasses, and cultivating perennial native grasses as carbon crops expand habitats for birds and other wildlife. So all of these practices really are worth doing. There is a catch though, and that is that while soils are excellent at storing CO2, they will only do so for as long as these kinds of soil management practices are sustained.
I want to talk about the rent versus buy concept. So there are two main ways to store carbon and keep it out of the atmosphere. The first way is through harnessing Mother Nature. Plants breathe carbon out of the air and store it in the soil or in their bodies, and it can stay there for years, up to centuries, but we have to maintain it. So we can think of that as renting carbon storage, because it doesn't cost that much, but we have to continuously invest in it over time. The other way we can store carbon is deep, deep underground in rocks. We call that geologic storage. It's pretty expensive and it's not quite scaled yet, but it's going to be an option that leads to relatively permanent carbon storage. So this is going to be the long-term solution that we're shooting for. We can think of this as buying carbon storage because it's a big investment, but it's a one-time investment. And eventually we're going to want to shift our investments from renting carbon storage to buying once we have that technology developed.
Permanent geologic storage of CO2 involves carbon dioxide removal approaches that mechanically extract CO2 from the air or from organic material like carbon crops. And these are explored in the Roads to Removal report and in our videos about direct air capture, biomass with carbon dioxide removal, and CO2 transport and storage. But while such technological solutions could be an important part of longer-term CDR strategy, it is important to take advantage of techniques like cropland management that are ready to scale now.
It's not just about one strategy or the other or selecting between different options. It's about doing all of them. And some of them can scale up more in the near term. So agricultural soil management, forest management, they have other benefits besides carbon removal. And they're things that we can do now without building physical facilities.
A final note about why this report adds such value to how we think about the role for cropland management is the county-by-county focus of the project. By examining how regional variation impacts the benefits of different carbon management practices, we can better see how targeted investments can maximize the CO2 removal potential of these techniques and maximize the benefits to farmers. Here's Dr. Kim Mayfield, who led the Energy, Equity, and Environmental Justice chapter of the report.
We did different analyses of the counties to see which counties you can approach that are going to really empower small family-owned farms, potentially ones that maybe don't own as much land as the large corporations, but they're still really important because they harbor most of America's diverse farm operatorship. And we want to empower all of America's farmers, not only maybe the ones that are best poised to do this, but also the ones that can benefit the most from an economic and an environmental perspective.
To learn more about the diverse approaches available for carbon removal in the United States, or to download the report, please visit roadstoremoval.org.